The wagon wheels didn't just stop. They ground into the dirt with a final, hateful shudder, and then there was only silence. A silence so loud it hurt. Little Molly pressed her face against the rough canvas, the scratchy fabric smelling of dust and endings. She watched her stepmother, Martha, climb down from the driver's seat. The woman moved like she was made of ice, every motion sharp and cold. "This is where you get off, girl," Martha said. She didn't even turn her head. The words flew back on the wind, brittle and sharp as broken glass. Molly was only 8 years old. She clutched her worn rag doll, Sarah, its button eyes staring blankly at the scene. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels beginning their slow, rhythmic crunch again. It rolled away, leaving her standing alone on a dusty trail that cut through the world like a scar. All around her was nothing but endless sagebrush and a sky so big it felt like it could swallow her whole. She was just a tiny speck in the vast, unforgiving emptiness, a forgotten secret left to be erased by the wind. But she wasn't alone. Not really. Watching from the high, rocky ridge above was a man. His name was Jake Morrison, and he was the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. He lowered a brass spyglass from his eye, his face hard as granite. He had seen the whole thing. The woman, the child, the heartless abandonment. And in that moment, a decision was made. A decision that would not just change Molly's life, but shatter everything she thought she knew about who she was, where she came from, and the secrets buried deep in the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. Her life wasn't just about to change, it was about to explode. The autumn wind was a blade, slicing right through Molly's thin, threadbare dress. She stood frozen in the middle of the Oregon Trail, a statue of disbelief. The dust cloud from Martha's wagon grew smaller and smaller, a fading puff of smoke against the horizon, until it was completely gone. Poof. Just like her father. Just like her mother. Just like her whole life. Her bare feet, already calloused and tough for a child her age, were beginning to ache on the sharp rocks. The sun was bleeding out across the western sky, painting the clouds in angry shades of orange and red. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. She wasn't talking to the sky, she was talking to Sarah, her doll. It was the only thing she had left of her real mother, a woman she barely remembered, taken by fever 2 winters ago. "What do we do now?" Sarah, as always, said nothing. Molly had always known Martha didn't want her. It was a cold, hard fact of her life, like the sunrise or the winter chill. After Papa died in a mining collapse last spring, the whispers had turned to shouts. "Feeding one mouth is hard enough," Martha would say, her eyes never quite meeting Molly's. "You're not even my blood. Your papa left me with nothing but debts and you." She looked around at the empty prairie. It was beautiful, but a terrifying kind of beautiful. The grown-ups on the wagon train had whispered stories around the campfires. Stories of wolves with eyes like yellow coals, of bears that could tear a man in two, of dangers that lurked behind every rock and in every shadow. Her stomach let out a low, pathetic growl. She had nothing. No food, no water, no blanket to shield her from the coming cold of the night, no shoes for her feet, just a thin cotton dress and a rag doll. But Molly was a survivor. Martha had made sure of that. Living with a woman who saw you as a burden teaches you to be strong, or it teaches you to break. Molly hadn't broken. Not yet. She squared her small shoulders, lifted her chin, and held Sarah tight against her chest. She picked a direction, it didn't matter which one, and she started to walk. Up on the ridge, Jake Morrison's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. He'd been tracking a herd of wild mustangs, a welcome distraction from the echoing silence of his life. Then, he saw the wagon. He saw the woman shove the child out. He saw her drive away without a single glance back. A fire ignited in his gut, a cold, righteous fury. Jake was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands weathered by rope and leather, and eyes that were surprisingly kind for a man who had seen so much hardship. At 35, he owned the Double M Ranch, the largest spread in the Wyoming Territory. He had more cattle than he could count, more land than he could ride in a day, and a big, beautiful house that was filled with nothing but loneliness. People called him the richest cowboy in 3 counties. But what good was money when it couldn't buy back a life? What good were 1,000 acres when they couldn't fill the one empty space in his heart? He'd been married once, a long time ago. Her name was Elizabeth. She was a sweet girl with a laugh like wind chimes. They had planned to fill that big house with the sound of children's laughter. But Elizabeth had died, stolen by a fever during childbirth, taking their infant son with her. That was 10 years ago. 10 years of silence. Now, he watched this little slip of a girl walking across the prairie with her head held high, as if she were daring the world to throw its worst at her. She had a stubborn courage that reminded him so much of Elizabeth it made his chest ache. In that moment, Jake Morrison's quiet, orderly world tilted on its axis. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a witness, and he would not stand by and do nothing. He spurred his horse, a powerful buckskin named Thunder, and started down the steep, rocky slope of the ridge. Molly heard the horse before she saw it. The sound of hooves on rock, fast and steady. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She clutched Sarah so tightly, she was surprised the doll didn't rip. She was ready to run. She was always ready to run. But the rider who appeared over the rise was different. He wasn't like the rough, dirty men who had sometimes visited Martha, their eyes lingering on her in ways that made her skin crawl. This man sat tall in his saddle, his presence commanding, but not threatening. He pulled his horse to a stop a few feet away, the buckskin snorting and stamping in the dust. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect she had rarely seen. "Afternoon, miss," he said. His voice was deep and gentle, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You seem to be a long way from anywhere." Molly lifted her chin, trying to look braver than she felt. "I'm going to Oregon," she announced, though she had no earthly idea which way Oregon was. The man's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "Oregon's a far piece from here," he said gravely. "Mind if I ask where your folks are?" "Don't have any folks," Molly said simply. The words came out flat, without a trace of self-pity. "My mama died, my papa died, and my stepmother left me here." Jake felt that fire in his gut roar to life. He kept his voice calm, but it was an effort. "Left you here? On purpose?" "She said she couldn't feed me anymore," Molly recited, her voice as matter-of-fact as if she were talking about the weather. "Said I wasn't her problem." The coldness of it struck Jake harder than any physical blow. He swung himself down from his horse, his boots landing softly in the dust. He knelt so he could look this tiny, fierce child in the eye. "What's your name, little lady?" "Molly Rose Patterson, and this is Sarah." She held up the doll for his inspection, as if introducing a duchess. "Well, Miss Molly Rose Patterson, I'm Jake Morrison. I own a ranch not too far from here." He paused, studying her dusty face and the defiant spark in her eyes. "And I was wondering if you and Sarah might like to come have some supper with me. My cook, Rosa, makes the best beef stew in the whole Wyoming Territory." Molly studied his face. Martha had filled her head with warnings about strangers, about bad men who did terrible things to little girls. But this man had kind eyes, and her stomach was a hollow, aching pit. "I don't have any money to pay for supper," she said, her voice small but firm. "Well, that's lucky," Jake said, a real smile finally breaking through his stern expression. "Because I don't charge little girls for supper. It's against my policy." Despite everything, a tiny smile touched Molly's own lips. "You have a policy about little girls?" "I do indeed," he said, his tone serious. "Rule number 1, little girls eat for free. Rule number 2, little girls should never be left on dusty trails all by themselves. And rule number 3." Little girls should always have a warm, safe place to sleep. Molly's gaze drifted from his honest face to the vast, empty prairie, then back again. The sun was almost gone, and a deep chill was settling in the air. "Are you a good man, Mr. Morrison?" she asked. The question was so direct, so pure, it hit Jake right in the heart. He swallowed. "I try to be, Miss Molly," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I try real hard to be." She nodded slowly, a solemn, ancient wisdom in her young eyes. She held the rag doll up to her ear, as if listening intently. Then she looked back at Jake. "Sarah says it's okay to trust you." Jake looked at the worn-out doll with the utmost seriousness. "Well, if Sarah says so, then that settles it." He stood up and held out his big, calloused hand. "Shall we go get that stew?" Molly hesitated for only a second. Then she placed her small, dusty hand in his. The moment their skin touched, Jake felt something shift deep inside his chest. A door that had been locked and barred for 10 long years creaked open just a crack. He lifted her up onto the saddle in front of him, and as he mounted behind her, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he was not just taking this child to supper, he was taking her home. But he had no idea what he was truly bringing to his ranch. He thought he was saving a lost child. He was wrong. He was bringing a storm that carried a secret so powerful it would one day force him to choose between the law of the land and the law of his own heart. The Double M Ranch wasn't just a ranch. It was a kingdom carved out of the wilderness. It spread across a wide green valley, a small town unto itself. Molly, perched on the front of Jake's saddle, had never seen anything like it. There were sprawling barns and corrals filled with horses, a long bunkhouse where the cowboys lived, and a cookhouse from which the most delicious smells she had ever imagined were drifting out on the evening air. But it was the main house that stole her breath. It was a fortress built of massive logs and river stone, with a wide porch that wrapped all the way around the front. Lanterns glowed warmly in the windows, making it look like a haven, a beacon of safety in the vast, dark landscape. "You live in there all by yourself?" Molly asked, her voice filled with awe as Jake gently lifted her down from his horse. "Just me and Rosa, my housekeeper," Jake said. "Gets pretty quiet sometimes." As if summoned by her name, a woman appeared on the porch. She was a plump Mexican woman with strands of silver woven into her dark, braided hair. She had the kindest face Molly had ever seen, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Dios mío!" Rosa exclaimed, her hands flying to her cheeks as she saw Molly. Her gaze took in the thin dress, the bare, scratched feet, the tangled hair, and the fierce grip on the rag doll. "Jake, what have you brought home now?" "Rosa, this is Miss Molly Rose Patterson," Jake said, his voice formal. "She's going to be our guest for supper." Rosa didn't wait. She hurried down the porch steps and knelt in the dust in front of Molly, her warm hands gently taking one of Molly's. She turned it over, her thumb brushing across the calloused palm. "Ay, pobrechita," she murmured, her voice soft and full of a sorrow that Molly didn't understand. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." "Just since yesterday," Molly corrected her politely, "and I had half a biscuit then." Rosa's eyes flashed with a sudden hot anger, but when she looked at Molly, her expression was nothing but gentle. "Well, we will fix that right up. Come, Nina, let's get you cleaned up and fed." Jake watched as Rosa led Molly into the house, chattering away in a comforting mix of English and Spanish. The little girl looked so small, so impossibly fragile, framed in the huge doorway of his massive house. He felt that protective fire surge inside him again, stronger than ever. Later that evening, after Molly had devoured 2 bowls of stew and a chunk of cornbread, she fell asleep right there on the big leather sofa by the stone fireplace, still clutching her doll. "So she is staying, isn't she?" Rosa asked quietly. She stood beside Jake, her arms crossed, watching the sleeping child. Jake looked at the little girl, at the way her chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. He saw the faint, pale scars on her arms, thin white lines that spoke of old injuries. "I can't just send her to the orphanage in Cheyenne," he said, his voice a low growl. "She's been through enough." "She has been through more than enough," Rosa agreed, her voice tight. "Look at those hands. She has been working hard for someone so small." Jake had noticed her hands, too. They were the hands of a field worker, not a child. Rough, chapped, with tiny puckered scars near the knuckles that looked suspiciously like old burns. What kind of monster would do that to a child? What kind of woman would make an 8-year-old work like a slave and then cast her aside like trash? "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Jake said, his decision solidifying into something unbreakable. "Talk to Judge Wheeler. See what needs to be done, legal-like." Rosa smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "So, she is staying." Jake looked at Molly again. Even in sleep, her face was tense, her small hand protectively wrapped around her doll, as if she feared it, too, would be taken from her. "Yeah," he said softly, a wave of fierce possessiveness washing over him. "She's staying." But as he looked at the doll, a strange thought pricked at him. It was just a simple rag doll, crudely stitched. Yet Molly guarded it like it was the crown jewels. There was something more to it. He could feel it. He just didn't know what it was yet. Molly woke up in a cloud, a soft, warm, fluffy cloud that smelled of lavender and sunshine. For a moment, she was utterly disoriented. The last bed she'd slept in was a lumpy straw mattress on the floor of Martha's wagon. This was something from a dream. She sat up, her eyes wide. She was in a real room. A room with glass windows and pretty lace curtains. A colorful, hand-stitched quilt covered the bed, and a thick woven rug lay on the polished wood floor. She saw Rosa setting a pitcher of warm water on a washstand in the corner. "Buenos dias, niña," Rosa said, her smile as warm as the morning sun. "Did you sleep well?" Molly could only nod, looking around the room in wonder. Is this really for me?" "See, this is your room now," Rosa said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her weight made the mattress sink comfortably. "Jake, he says you are to stay here, as long as you want." "Really?" The word was a breath, full of disbelief. "But I can't pay for it. I don't have anything." Rosa's kind face grew serious. She took Molly's hand again. "Nina, listen to me. That man, Jake Morrison, he is a good man. But his heart, it was broken a long time ago, and it never healed right. It was a cold, empty house." She paused, her dark eyes searching Molly's. "But yesterday, when he brought you home, I saw something in his eyes, something I have not seen in 10 long years." "What?" Molly whispered. "What did you see?" "Hope," Rosa said simply. "Now come, let's get you dressed. I have something for you." The something was a dress. A beautiful blue dress with layers of petticoats that rustled when she moved. It was a little too big, but Rosa promised to alter it. And there were shoes. Real leather shoes, the first Molly had ever owned that hadn't been worn-out hand-me-downs. "Where did these come from?" Molly asked, running her hands over the soft cotton fabric of the dress. It felt like heaven. Rosa's eyes grew sad for a moment, a shadow passing over them. "They belonged to someone," she said softly. "Someone who doesn't need them anymore. Someone who would be very, very happy to know a sweet little girl was wearing them." Molly didn't understand. She didn't know that the clothes, the room, the very hope she represented, had all belonged to Elizabeth Morrison, Jake's long-lost wife. He had kept it all, a perfectly preserved shrine to a life that never was. He couldn't bear to part with any of it, until now. Until Molly. When Molly came downstairs, clean and radiant in her new dress and shoes, Jake was waiting in the sun-drenched kitchen. A plate piled high with hotcakes and sizzling bacon sat on the table. He looked up, and for a moment, he just stared. He had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Well, don't you look fine?" he said, his voice sounding a little rough, a little thick. "Rosa says I can stay here," Molly said, climbing onto a chair that was almost too tall for her. "I can work. I'm good at scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Martha said so." "I'm sure you are," Jake said gently, sitting across from her. "But a little girl shouldn't be scrubbing floors. A little girl should be learning her letters, learning how to read and write." Molly's head snapped up. "Read?" she whispered. You would teach me to read?" Martha had always said reading was a waste of time for a girl. "I would," Jake said, "and arithmetic, and how to ride a horse properly, how to be a young lady." He reached across the table and patted her small hand. "If you want to learn, that is." "Yes," Molly breathed, her heart swelling with a joy so powerful it almost hurt. "Oh, yes, please." The next few weeks passed in a blur of wondrous new experiences. Every morning, Jake would sit with her in his study, a room lined with more books than Molly had ever imagined existed. He taught her letters and numbers, and her mind, quick and thirsty for knowledge, soaked it all up like a dry sponge. Soon, she was piecing together words, then sentences. "Look, Sarah," she would whisper to her doll at night, tracing the words in a simple primer. "The cat sat on the mat. Isn't that wonderful?" In the afternoons, Jake taught her to ride. He put her on a gentle old mare named Buttercup, whose placid nature was perfect for a nervous beginner. At first, Molly was terrified, clinging to the saddle horn, but Jake walked beside her, his hand always on the rein, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon, after she'd managed a full circuit of the corral by herself. His voice was filled with a pride that warmed her from the inside out. Rosa taught her other things: how to knead bread, how to sew a straight seam, how to tell stories while they worked, singing beautiful Mexican songs that made Molly laugh. "In Mexico, where I grew up," Rosa said one day as they were shaping tortillas, her hands moving with practiced grace, "my abuela, my grandmother, she used to say that God puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. El uno para el otro, one for the other." She looked at Molly, her eyes soft. "Jake, he needed you, Nina, and you needed him." "But I'm nobody special," Molly said, patting her own lopsided tortilla. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong," Rosa said, tapping Molly's nose with a flour-dusted finger. "You are very special. You have a brave heart and a strong spirit. Jake, he sees this. That is why he wants you to stay. Forever." Forever. The word echoed in Molly's mind. It was a concept she had never dared to consider. Forever had always been for other people. That evening, Jake was reading her a story before bed. It was about a clever princess who outsmarted a greedy king. Molly looked up from the book, her head resting against his strong chest. "Jake?" she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Could I call you Papa?" Jake's hand stilled on the page. The world seemed to stop. For a long, silent moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He looked down at the small girl nestled against him, her hopeful eyes gazing up at him. His own eyes burned with unshed tears. "I'd be honored," he finally managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. "I'd be real honored." Molly smiled, a brilliant, soul-healing smile, and snuggled closer. "Good night, Papa." "Good night, little one," he whispered, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "Sweet dreams." As he sat there, long after she had fallen asleep, he realized with a startling clarity that he was falling in love with this child, this fierce, brave, abandoned little girl. He would protect her with his life. He would fight dragons for her. But Jake Morrison had no idea that the real dragons weren't creatures of myth. They were made of flesh and blood and greed. and they were coming for her. Life at the Double M settled into a happy, predictable rhythm, but the shadows of Molly's past still lingered. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, trapped in a nightmare where she was back on that dusty trail, the wagon shrinking in the distance. Jake would hear her cries and come to her room, his big, comforting presence chasing the darkness away. He would sit on the edge of her bed until her breathing evened out, sometimes humming the old lullabies Elizabeth used to love. There were other challenges, too. A few of the older ranch hands, men set in their ways, didn't know what to make of the boss suddenly having a daughter. They whispered in the bunkhouse when they thought no one could hear. "Got him wrapped around her little finger," Molly heard Cookie, the grizzled camp cook, mutter to one of the others. "Mark my words, a stray like that, she'll bring nothing but trouble." But most of the men were kind. Old Pete, a cowboy who'd worked for Jake's father, carved her a small, perfect wooden horse. A young hand named Billy taught her how to whistle, a piercing shriek that could call the ranch dogs from across the yard. And Tex, the formidable ranch foreman, always tipped his hat to her with a solemn "ma'am," as if she were a grown-up lady. One crisp autumn day, about 2 months after Molly had arrived, a stranger came to the ranch. He was a thin, severe-looking man in a dusty black suit, and he rode a horse that looked as tired as he did. He introduced himself as Silas Hartwell, a representative of the Territorial Children's Aid Society. "I've received reports," he announced, his voice dry as dust, "of an unaccompanied minor residing at this ranch." He looked around at the rustic log home, his nose wrinkled in disapproval. "A ranch is no place for a young girl. She belongs in a proper institution where she can be raised appropriately." Molly, who had been listening from behind the kitchen door, felt a cold dread wash over her. Her heart, which had just started to feel safe, froze in her chest. They were going to take her away. "This little girl has a home. Here," Jake said, his voice as hard and unyielding as the river stones in his fireplace. "And as of last week, she's been legally adopted. I have the papers from Judge Wheeler right here." "Be that as it may," Hartwell said, unfazed. "A single man raising a female child alone is highly irregular. The society feels she would be better served in one of our facilities." "Your facilities?" Jake's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. "You mean that orphanage in Cheyenne? The one where children work 14 hours a day and sleep 4 to a bed with barely enough food to keep them alive?" "We provide structure and discipline," Hartwell said stiffly. "You provide misery," Jake shot back, his patience snapping. "Now get off my land before I have you thrown off." After the man had scurried away, his departure hastened by the menacing stare of Tex, who had mysteriously appeared on the porch. Molly crept out of her hiding place. Jake was standing by the window, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Papa?" she said, her voice small and trembling. "Are they going to take me away?" Jake spun around. In 2 long strides, he was across the room, kneeling and pulling her into a fierce, protective hug. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice a raw whisper against her hair. "Nobody is ever going to take you away from me. This is your home. I'm your papa, and that's the end of it." "But what if they come back?" "Then we'll fight them," Jake said, holding her tighter. "We will fight them again and again, as many times as it takes." He pulled back to look her in the eyes, his own blazing with conviction. "You are my daughter now, Molly Rose Morrison. That's not a piece of paper. That's a fact, and nobody can ever change it." Molly felt the fear drain out of her, replaced by a fierce, soaring love. Morrison. She was Molly Rose Morrison. She had a real name, a family name. She belonged. That night, alone in her room, the memory of Hartwell's cold eyes lingered. The fear was still there, a small, cold knot in her stomach. He had threatened her new life, her papa. She needed to be strong. She needed to be ready. She went to her bed and picked up Sarah, the rag doll. Her fingers, small but surprisingly nimble, found a loose stitch in the doll's side, a stitch she herself had sewn to be easily opened. She carefully worked it free. This was her secret, the one thing she had never told Jake or Rosa. Inside the doll's cotton stuffing was a small, flat object wrapped in oilskin. Her real mother had put it there years ago, on the day she knew she was dying. "Don't you ever let them see this, Molly," she had whispered, her voice weak with fever. "Don't you show it to anyone, you hear me? Not until you find a truly good man." Molly unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter. She was just starting to read, but she could make out a few of the words now. "My dearest Molly Rose," it began. She could read her name, and a few other words scattered across the page. Patterson claim, deed, silver, trust no one. She didn't understand what it all meant. A claim? A deed? What was silver? It was a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. She carefully folded the paper, wrapped it back in the oilskin, and tucked it deep inside Sarah's stuffing, sewing the seam shut again. She didn't know what the secret was, but her mother had told her to protect it. And after the visit from Mr. Hartwell, she knew, with a child's unerring instinct, that this secret was more important than ever. It was a weapon, and one day she might have to use it. Winter descended on the Double M, blanketing the valley in a thick layer of pristine white snow. The world grew quiet, insulated. Inside the big log house, however, life was warmer and brighter than ever. Molly thrived. She could now read entire books by herself, curled up by the fire. She could write her name in a flowing, perfect cursive and solve arithmetic problems that would stump children twice her age. She rode Buttercup with a confidence that amazed the cowboys, her small figure flying across the snow-covered fields. But more importantly, the hard knot of fear in her stomach was slowly, finally, beginning to dissolve. She was learning to trust, to believe that this life, this family, was real and permanent. One snowy December morning, Jake called her into his study. This was their schoolroom, but it was also his private sanctuary, a place of leather-bound books, polished wood, and the faint, pleasant smell of tobacco and old paper. "I have something for you," he said, his voice gentle. He pulled a small, velvet-wrapped package from his desk drawer. Molly unwrapped it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a beautiful gold locket on a delicate chain. It was old and exquisitely crafted. Her small fingers fumbled with the clasp. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside was a tiny hand-painted photograph of a woman with Jake's kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's Elizabeth," Jake said softly. "My wife." His voice was thick with memory. She would have loved you very much." "She's beautiful," Molly whispered, tracing the tiny, perfect face with the tip of her finger. "She always wanted a daughter," Jake continued, his gaze distant. "Someone to teach and love and watch grow up." He looked at Molly, his eyes shining with a profound, startling belief. I think maybe she sent you to me, Molly, to fill the silence." "Really?" Molly looked up at him, her own eyes wide. "Really," he said with conviction. "And I want you to have her locket. Not because I'm trying to replace your real mama, but because you are a part of our family now. And Elizabeth, she would want the daughter of this house to wear it." Jake's hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he fastened the delicate chain around Molly's neck. It hung a little low on her small frame, but she didn't care. She touched it reverently. "Thank you, Papa," she said, launching herself into his arms for a fierce hug. "I'll take good care of it. I promise." "I know you will, sweetheart. I know you will." That night, as Molly got ready for bed, she looked at her reflection in the small mirror in her room. The scared, hungry, forgotten little girl was gone. In her place was a girl with bright eyes, a warm home, and a future. She was Molly Rose Morrison. She touched the locket at her throat. Then her eyes went to the rag doll, Sarah, sitting on her pillow. 2 secrets. One she wore around her neck, a symbol of a family found. The other she kept hidden inside the doll, a mystery from a family lost. She had a feeling deep in her bones that the two were connected, that one day the secret of the past would be the only thing that could save her future. Spring came to Wyoming like a promise fulfilled. The snow melted, the rivers swelled, and the valley floor erupted in a riot of green grass and wildflowers. Molly celebrated her 9th birthday, and the Double M threw a party bigger than anything the county had ever seen. Ranch hands and their families, neighbors from homesteads miles away, everyone came to celebrate the boss's daughter. Rosa baked a magnificent cake with 9 candles, and Jake gave Molly a gift that made her scream with delight, her very own horse, a spirited young mare with a coat the color of daisies. Molly named her Daisy on the spot. Life was perfect. Utterly, completely, unbelievably perfect, which, of course, was why it couldn't last. The past came rattling up the Long Ranch Road on a hot, dusty July morning. It came in the form of the same dilapidated wagon that had abandoned her nearly a year ago. But this time, Martha wasn't alone. A heavy-set, brutish man with small, mean eyes sat beside her on the driver's bench. Behind the wagon, 2 rough-looking cowboys on horseback kicked up dust, their faces hard and unsmiling. Molly was in the garden with Rosa, picking beans for supper. The moment she saw the wagon, the moment she saw her stepmother's face, all the color drained from her own. The world tilted, the vibrant greens and blues of the garden fading to a dull, terrifying gray. "Dios mío," Rosa breathed, her hand instinctively grabbing Molly's arm and pulling the child behind her skirts. Jake emerged from the main barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His easygoing expression vanished the instant he saw the visitors. His face hardened into a thunderous mask. "Martha Patterson," he said, his voice low and cold as a winter wind. "You've got some nerve showing your face on my land." Martha climbed down from the wagon, pulling her worn dress straight in a pathetic attempt at dignity. "I've come for my stepdaughter," she announced, her voice pitched loud enough for the whole ranch to hear. Jake let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Your stepdaughter? You mean the one you dumped on the trail like a bag of garbage and left to die?" I was going through hard times," Martha stammered, her eyes shifting away from Jake's furious gaze. "But things are better now. Cyrus, here. Cyrus is my new husband. We can provide for Molly properly now." The heavy-set man, Cyrus, lumbered forward. He smelled of sweat and cheap whiskey. "Name's Cyrus Blakemore," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "and I aim to collect what's legally mine." "Molly isn't yours," Jake said quietly, but there was a deadly current of violence in his tone. "She's my legally adopted daughter. Now turn that wagon around and get out." "Well, see, that's where you're wrong, Morrison," Cyrus said, a smug, ugly smile spreading across his thick lips. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He flicked it open with a snap. "This here says different. Says I'm her legal guardian now, seeing as how I married her stepmother. All signed and sealed by a judge." Jake snatched the paper from his hand. He read it, his jaw getting tighter and tighter with every line. It looked official. It had stamps and signatures and complex legal jargon. "This is a fraud," Jake said, his voice shaking with rage. "That's signed by Judge Silas Hartwell down in Colorado Territory," Cyrus sneered. "All legal and proper. We got the law on our side." Hartwell. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. The man from the Children's Aid Society. This wasn't a random event. This was a planned attack. Behind Rosa, Molly was trembling, not with fear, but with a horrifying jolt of recognition. She remembered Cyrus now. He was one of the men who used to visit Martha, one of the men whose piggy eyes had always made her feel dirty. I'm not going with you, she said, stepping out from behind Rosa's skirts. Her voice was small, but it was as firm as a rock. Martha's face twisted into an ugly sneer. You'll do as you're told, you ungrateful little brat. After all I did for you. All you did? Molly's fear was being burned away by a white-hot anger. You made me work like a slave. You burned me with the flat iron when I didn't work fast enough. You left me to die. I never, Martha shrieked, her face turning beet red. The child has scars, Jake said, his voice now dangerously soft. I've seen them. Cyrus just shrugged, his expression callous. Kids get bumps and bruises, part of growing up. Now we'll be taking her and going. No, Molly said again, her voice stronger this time. I won't go. Papa Jake is my papa now. This is my home. Cyrus's small eyes narrowed into vicious slits. Maybe you need to be reminded of your place, girl. He took a lumbering step toward Molly, but Jake moved faster than lightning. One moment, Cyrus was reaching for the child. The next, he was flat on his back in the dust, gasping for air, with the heel of Jake's boot pressed firmly on his chest. Touch her, Jake said, his voice a simple, terrifying promise of death, and you die. The two hired cowboys behind the wagon went for their guns. It was a fatal mistake. Before their hands could even clear leather, they found themselves staring down the barrels of 6 rifles. Tex, Pete, Billy, and 3 other ranch hands had appeared as if from thin air, silent and deadly, their weapons trained with chilling precision. I'd think real careful about your next move, friend, Tex drawled, his voice lazy but his eyes cold as ice. The standoff stretched into a long, tense silence, broken only by Cyrus's wheezing gasps. Finally, Jake removed his boot. Cyrus scrambled to his feet, brushing the dust from his filthy clothes, his face a mask of purple fury and humiliation. This ain't over, Morrison, he snarled, spitting a wad of bloody saliva into the dirt. I got legal papers. I'll be back, and I'll be back with the sheriff. You do that, Jake said calmly, his gaze never wavering. And when you do, make sure you bring a real judge, because we're going to find out just how legal those papers of yours really are. As the wagon rattled away in a cloud of angry dust, Jake swept Molly up into his arms. She was shaking like a leaf, the adrenaline finally giving way to terror. Are they going to take me away, Papa? She whispered into his shoulder. Not while I'm breathing, Jake said fiercely, his arms a steel cage around her. But as he held her, a cold dread settled in his own heart. A piece of paper, a corrupt judge. This wasn't a fight he could win with fists or guns. This was a different kind of war, and he had a sickening feeling that Cyrus Blakemore hadn't played his final, most devastating card yet. That evening, the big house at the Double M, usually so full of warmth and laughter, was cloaked in a tense silence. Jake had called a council of war. He, Rosa, Tex, and old Pete sat around the massive kitchen table, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on their grim faces. What do we know about this Cyrus Blakemore? Jake asked, his voice flat. Tex spat a stream of tobacco juice into the brass spittoon by the stove. Nothing good, he said. He's a bottom feeder, Jake. Drifts around the territories. Word is he makes his living off the misery of others. Got a nasty reputation for taking in orphans. Rosa's face went white. What does that mean, taking in? Tex shifted uncomfortably. It ain't charitable, Rosa. He finds kids with no one to protect them. Sometimes he gets legal-looking papers, sometimes he just snatches them. He rents them out. To mines, to logging camps, anywhere they need cheap, disposable labor. The kid works for their keep, and anything extra goes straight into Blakemore's pocket. Dios santo, Rosa whispered, crossing herself. They sell children. Jake's hands, resting on the table, clenched into white-knuckled fists. The thought of Molly in the hands of a man like that made him physically sick. Over my dead body, he growled. Problem is, boss, old Pete said, his weathered face etched with worry. If he's got papers that look official, signed by this Hartwell fella, He might be able to convince a territorial judge, especially if he starts slinging mud. What do you mean? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Well, Pete said slowly, avoiding Jake's eyes, you're a single man, living alone out here with a young girl who ain't your blood. Some folks might get the wrong idea. A man like Blakemore, he'll twist that, make you out to be something you're not. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Jake felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. The idea that anyone, anywhere, could think he would ever harm a single hair on Molly's head was unbearable. But he was a practical man. He knew Pete was right. In the court of public opinion, mud sticks. So what do we do? Rosa asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake looked around the table at the loyal faces of his friends, his family. We fight, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. But we do it smart, and we do it legal. I'm riding for Cheyenne at first light. I'm going to see Judge Wheeler. If anyone can untangle this mess, it's him. I'll come with you, Tex offered immediately. No, Jake said, shaking his head. I need you here, Tex. I need you to watch the ranch, to watch Molly. If Blakemore comes back before I do, you don't let him on this property. You don't let him anywhere near her. Do you understand? Understood, boss, Tex said, his expression grim. He won't lay a hand on her. Upstairs, hidden in the shadows at the top of the staircase, Molly had heard every word. A cold terror, worse than any nightmare, wrapped its icy fingers around her heart. She wasn't just in danger of losing her home. She was in danger of being sold, rented out, worked to death in a mine. She crept back to her room, her mind racing. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't be the cause of so much trouble for Jake, for Rosa, for everyone. She had to do something. She went to her bed and took out Sarah. Her fingers, no longer trembling, worked quickly at the hidden seam. She pulled out the oilskin packet. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the faded letter from her mother. She still couldn't read all of it, but she focused on the words she knew. Silver, deed, Patterson claim, trust no one, especially Martha. Patterson claim. That was her father's name. A deed, that meant land, and silver. She knew what silver was. It was money, coins, value. A sudden breathtaking thought struck her. What if her papa's land wasn't worthless, like Martha always said? What if it was valuable? Was that what this was all about? Was that why Cyrus Blakemore, a man who rented out children, suddenly wanted her? She looked at the locket around her neck, a symbol of her new life. Then she looked at the secret letter in her hand, a relic of her old one. She had to tell Jake. She had to show him. But her mother's words echoed in her mind. Trust no one. Did that include Jake? He was a good man, her papa. But he was still a stranger, really. Her mother hadn't known him. A wave of fear and confusion washed over her. She made a decision. She would wait. She would wait until Jake came back from Cheyenne. And then she would have to decide if he was the truly good man her mother had spoken of. The fate of her entire future might depend on it. Judge Horatio Wheeler was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding Cheyenne. He had a shock of silver hair, eyes as sharp and clear as a hawk's, and a reputation for being as unbending as iron when it came to the law. He'd known Jake Morrison for years and respected him. He was the one who had happily signed the adoption papers for Molly. He examined the document Jake had brought, the one bearing Cyrus Blakemore's authority, under a magnifying glass. He grunted. It's a fake, he said finally, tossing the paper onto his desk. But it's a damned good fake. This signature, this seal, someone went to a lot of trouble to make this look official. This Judge Hartwell in Colorado. I've heard the name. He's a snake. For the right price, he'll sign anything. So you can stop them? Jake asked, a surge of relief washing over him. I can try, the judge said, his expression sobering. But Jake, you need to understand something. The law isn't always about what's right, it's about what can be proven. Blakemore will drag you through the mud. He'll use the fact that you're a single man. He'll say a ranch is no place for a girl. Some judges might listen. Jake's heart sank like a stone. So they could still take her, even with a fraudulent document? It's possible, Wheeler admitted grimly. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. But I might have an idea. A way to make your position unassailable. I'll do anything, Jake said instantly. The judge looked at him shrewdly. What if you weren't a single man anymore, Jake? Jake stared at him, completely baffled. I don't understand. Marriage, son, the judge said plainly. If you were married to a respectable woman, no one could question your fitness to raise Molly. It would cut the legs out from under Blakemore's entire argument. Jake recoiled as if he'd been struck. Marry someone? Just for convenience? I can't do that. That wouldn't be fair to Molly or to the woman. I'm not talking about a marriage of convenience, Judge Wheeler said, a slight, knowing smile touching his lips. I'm talking about Rosa Velasquez. Jake's mouth fell open. Rosa? Good Lord, son, are you blind? The judge exclaimed. Don't tell me you haven't noticed the way that woman looks at you when you're not paying attention. Or the way you look at her, for that matter. Rosa Velasquez has been in love with you for years. And if you're honest with yourself, you've been in love with her too. You've just been too stubborn and too haunted by Elizabeth to see it. Jake sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. The world tilted on its axis. Rosa, sweet, kind, capable Rosa. The woman who had run his household with quiet efficiency for 5 years. The woman who had chattered away in Spanish to calm a terrified little girl. The woman who stood between Molly and a monster like a protective lioness. The woman whose presence had, little by little, turned his cold, empty house back into a home. He thought of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. He thought of her humming as she cooked, the sound a gentle, constant comfort. He thought of the way she'd cried with joy when he brought Molly home. When had it happened? When had he stopped seeing her as just his housekeeper and started seeing her? Even if that were true, Jake said slowly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. I couldn't ask her. Not like this. Not to save me from a legal battle. She deserves more than that. A real proposal, not a business arrangement. Jake Morrison, you are the most honorable and most stubborn fool I have ever had the misfortune to know, Judge Wheeler said, throwing his hands up in exasperation. I am not suggesting you use her. I am suggesting you wake up and see what's been right in front of your face for years. Go home, Jake. Open your eyes. The answer to all your problems and your loneliness is standing right there in your own kitchen. The long ride back to the Double M was a blur. Judge Wheeler's words echoed in Jake's head, chipping away at the walls he had built around his heart for a decade. He saw Rosa everywhere, in the warmth of the sun on his face, in the steadfast reliability of his horse, in the fierce beauty of the land he loved. He had been a blind fool. He loved her. It was a truth so simple and so profound, it shook him to his very soul. He loved Rosa Velasquez, and he was going to ask her to be his wife. By the time the familiar silhouette of the ranch came into view, his heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. He had a plan, but his plan was too late. As he rode into the ranch yard, his blood ran cold. There, standing in front of the main house, was Cyrus Blakemore and his 2 hired thugs, and with them, wearing a silver star on his chest, was Sheriff Davis from the county seat. And standing on the porch, her face pale but defiant, was Rosa. Molly was clinging to her skirts, her small face a mask of terror. I'm sorry, Jake, Sheriff Davis said, his expression genuinely pained. He held up the paper from Blakemore. But this looks official to me. Until a judge tells me otherwise, my hands are tied. I have to uphold the document. I have to let them take the girl. That document is a fraud, Sheriff, Jake roared, swinging down from his horse. Judge Wheeler himself confirmed it. Maybe so, Jake, and I believe you, the sheriff said unhappily. But I'm not a judge. I can't make that determination. All I see is a legal order. I have to err on the side of caution. I won't go, Molly cried out, her small voice piercing the tense air. This is my home. Papa Jake is my papa. Cyrus Blakemore stepped forward, that same ugly, triumphant smirk on his face. Come on now, girl. Don't make this any harder than it has to be. The law is the law. He reached out a grimy hand towards her. Wait! The voice came from the doorway of the house. It was Rosa. She stepped forward onto the porch, her back straight as a board, her chin held high. She was wearing her simple work dress, but she looked as regal as a queen. There's something you all need to know, she announced, her voice ringing out, clear and strong across the yard. Jake stared at her, his heart stopping. What was she doing? Rosa looked directly at Sheriff Davis, then her gaze flickered to Jake, a universe of meaning passing between them in a single, breathtaking second. You cannot take this child, she said, her voice unwavering, because Mr. Morrison's situation has changed. He is no longer a single man. She took a deep breath and delivered the final, stunning blow. Jake and I are getting married. Today. The ranch yard fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Cyrus Blakemore's jaw dropped. The sheriff blinked, utterly poleaxed. And Jake just stared at the incredible woman standing on his porch, a woman who was willing to sacrifice everything for him and the child they had both come to love. That's not possible. Martha, who had been lurking by the wagon, finally sputtered. You can't just... It's a trick. Actually, Sheriff Davis said slowly, a look of immense relief dawning on his face as he saw a legal way out of this nightmare. They can. And if Mr. Morrison is married to a respectable woman like Mrs. Velasquez here, then there's absolutely no question about his fitness to raise this child. It renders this whole document moot. Cyrus's face turned a shade of mottled purple. This is a setup, a sham. They're just doing this to keep the girl, he roared. Sheriff Davis turned his sharp, assessing gaze on Jake. Is he right, Morrison? He asked directly. Is this just a sham marriage to get around the law? This was the moment. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Jake looked away from the sheriff, away from the sputtering rage of Cyrus Blakemore. He looked at Rosa. She stood there, so brave, so beautiful, her heart in her eyes. And in that instant, all the confusion, all the grief, all the loneliness of the past 10 years fell away. Judge Wheeler was right. The answer had been right in front of him all along. He took a step toward the porch, his eyes never leaving hers. No, Sheriff, he said, and his voice was strong and sure and filled with a love so powerful it was a physical force in the air. It's not a sham. He looked back at the stunned crowd, but his words were only for her. I love her. I've loved her for a long time. And I should have told her, and all of you, years ago. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, a radiant, glorious smile that outshone the sun. Well then, Sheriff Davis said, a broad grin spreading across his own face. He clapped his hands together decisively. That settles that. I guess there's nothing more to discuss here. He turned to Jake and Rosa. Congratulations on your upcoming marriage. He then fixed Cyrus Blakemore with a stony glare. As for you, I suggest you get off this property before I decide to arrest you for disturbing the peace. Defeated and furious, Cyrus and his entourage mounted up and rode away, their threats and curses swallowed by the Wyoming wind. After they were gone, an awkward, beautiful silence fell. Jake slowly walked up the porch steps until he was standing in front of Rosa. He gently took both of her hands in his. Rosa, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, I need you to know What I said back there, it wasn't just to save Molly. I meant every single word. I know, she whispered, her tear-filled eyes shining with a love that mirrored his own. I have been waiting a very long time for you to figure it out, you stubborn blind man. Will you? He asked, his heart in his throat. Will you really marry me, Rosa? Not for Molly, not for the ranch, but because you want to be my wife? Rosa reached up and gently touched his cheek, her hand warm against his skin. Sí, mi amor, she whispered. I will marry you because I love you. I have loved you since the first day I came to this lonely house. From behind them, a small figure launched herself at them, wrapping her arms around both of their waists. Does this mean Rosa is going to be my mama now? Molly asked, her voice muffled against them. Rosa knelt down, pulling Molly into the hug, her tears of joy finally falling freely. If you want me to be mi corazón, she said, her voice choked with happiness. Oh, yes, Molly breathed, her voice filled with a joy so pure it could heal any wound. I want that more than anything in the whole wide world. They were married that very afternoon. Judge Wheeler, having received an urgent telegram from Jake, rode out from Cheyenne himself to perform the ceremony on the front porch of the Double M. The entire ranch crew gathered, their hats in their hands, their faces beaming. Rosa wore Elizabeth's wedding dress. Jake had offered it to her, his voice trembling, saying, "She would want you to have it. She would want this house to be filled with happiness." And Rosa, with tears in her own eyes, had accepted. Molly stood beside them as their witness, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself, her face glowing. When Judge Wheeler pronounced them husband and wife, the cowboys let out a whoop and fired their pistols into the air in a ragged, joyous salute. That evening, the three of them, this new, unlikely and absolutely perfect family, sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set fire to the western sky. Molly was curled up between her new parents, her head resting on Jake's chest, her hand held tightly in Rosa's. "Papa," Molly said softly after a long, peaceful silence, "there's something I have to show you." A new chapter had begun. But Molly knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the warmth of her parents' arms, that the old chapter wasn't finished yet. Cyrus Blakemore was not a man who gave up easily, and she was holding the one secret that could either save them all or get them killed. A fragile peace settled over the Double M. For 3 days, life felt almost normal, almost magical. The house was filled with a new kind of warmth, the easy laughter of a family that had fought a dragon and won. But the shadow of Cyrus Blakemore lingered at the edges of their happiness. Jake knew it. Rosa felt it. And Molly, most of all, knew they were living on borrowed time. On the third night after the wedding, Molly made her decision. Her new family was built on love, but also on a lie. A beautiful lie, but a lie nonetheless. Their marriage had been born of necessity. She couldn't keep her own secrets any longer. She had to trust them. Completely. She found Jake in his study. He was bent over a large map of the territory spread across his massive oak desk, making notes in a ledger. The room was quiet, filled with the comforting smell of old books and leather. "Papa?" she said from the doorway. Jake looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Hey there, little one. Shouldn't you be in bed?" "I couldn't sleep," she said, walking into the room. She was clutching Sarah the rag doll so tightly her knuckles were white. "I have something to show you. Something important." Jake's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. He pushed the ledger aside and gave her his full attention. "What is it, Molly?" With trembling fingers, Molly found the loose seam on Sarah's side and carefully pulled it open. She reached inside and pulled out the small, oilskin-wrapped packet. She handed it to Jake without a word. Jake took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He unwrapped the oilskin and unfolded the yellowed, brittle paper inside. It was a letter, the ink faded, but still legible in the lamplight. He began to read aloud, his voice low and steady. "My dearest Molly Rose," he read. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the worst has happened. I have no time to explain everything. Your father was not just a simple prospector. He was a geologist. He knew things about the earth that other men did not. Just before he died, he found it. A vein of silver so rich it could make us kings. It is on our land, the Patterson claim. The deed is with this letter. Do not trust Martha. She is a greedy, cruel woman. She knows nothing of the silver, but she will take the land if she can. You must guard this secret. Do not show this to anyone, not until you find a truly good man, a man of honor who will protect you. This land is your birthright, my darling. It is your future. Do not let them take it from you. All my love, your mother, Eleanor Patterson." A profound silence filled the study. Attached to the letter with a rusty pin was another folded document. Jake opened it. It was a legal deed, properly filed and recorded, for a 160-acre plot of land designated as the Patterson claim. Molly watched his face, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw shock, then awe, then something else, something she couldn't read. A strange, pale look washed over his features. Without a word, Jake turned back to the large map on his desk. His finger, shaking slightly, traced a line along a creek bed in the foothills north of his own property. He stopped at a square of land marked with a small X. He looked from the map to the deed in his hand, then back to the map. He slowly reached for the heavy ledger he had been working on when she came in. He opened it to a page filled with his own neat, decisive handwriting. His face went ashen. "What is it, Papa?" Molly whispered, a new kind of fear creeping into her voice. Jake looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was one of pure, gut-wrenching horror. "Oh God, Molly," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. "What have I done?" He pointed a trembling finger at a line item in the ledger. "The Patterson claim," he said, his voice cracking. "Last year, a bundle of supposedly worthless mining claims went up for auction, for back taxes. I bought them all, for pennies on the dollar." He held up the deed from her mother's letter, then pointed to his ledger. "According to the law, this land, Molly, your land, your silver, it's mine. I own it." The world crashed down around Molly. The truly good man her mother had written of, her hero, her papa, had unknowingly stolen her birthright. The secret she had guarded for so long wasn't a weapon to save them. It was a grenade that had just blown their new family apart. Jake looked up and saw Rosa standing in the doorway, her face a mask of shock. She had heard everything. He was trapped. By law, he was the owner of a fortune. By heart, he was the man who had just stolen everything from the little girl he loved more than life itself. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Cyrus Blakemore wasn't just after a child to use for labor. He knew about the silver, and he would be back to claim it all. The confession hung in the air of the study, heavy and suffocating. Jake looked from the deed in his hand to Molly's wide, terrified eyes, and felt like the lowest creature on earth. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words sounding hollow and useless even to his own ears. "Molly, I swear to you I had no idea." Rosa moved silently into the room, her presence a calming balm in the storm of chaos. She put a hand on Jake's shoulder, then knelt down in front of Molly, taking the child's cold hands in her own. "Listen to me, mi corazón," Rosa said, her voice soft but firm. "Your papa did not steal from you. He did not know. Do you understand?" Molly could only nod, tears welling in her eyes. Rosa looked up at Jake, her gaze clear and resolute. "This does not change anything, Jake. It makes it clearer. This is not a curse. This is a gift. This is the weapon God has given us to protect her." "How?" Jake asked, his voice raw with despair. "The law says I own it. When Blakemore comes back, and he'll claim I married you and adopted her just to get my hands on this land. He'll paint me as a monster, and this time he'll have proof to make it look true. Then we will not use the law of man, Rosa said, her eyes flashing. We will use the law of the heart. We will do what is right, and we will trust that it is enough. Their moment of desperate planning was shattered by the frantic pounding of hooves in the yard. Tex burst into the house without knocking, his face grim. "Jake, Ryder's comin'. It's Blakemore, and he's got company. A man in a suit." Jake, Rosa, and Molly rushed to the window. In the moonlight they could see them. Cyrus Blakemore and his two thugs, and beside them a portly man in an expensive suit, riding a fine black horse. A lawyer. They didn't even try to come to the house. They stopped at the edge of the property, and the lawyer began hammering a stake into the ground. To it, he nailed a large, official-looking notice. The next morning, Jake rode out to read it. It was a formal legal challenge. Cyrus Blakemore, on behalf of his wife Martha Patterson, was petitioning the territorial court. The notice claimed that Jake Morrison's marriage was a fraud, that Molly's adoption was obtained under false pretenses, and that Jake had used the child to illegally seize control of the valuable Patterson mining claim. It demanded the immediate return of the child to her rightful guardians and the surrender of the land. The fight was no longer about custody. It was about everything: their family, their home, their honor, and a fortune in silver. The court date was set for 1 week later in Cheyenne. The news spread through the territory like wildfire. It became the talk of every saloon and general store. The lonely rancher who adopted the orphan girl versus the greedy stepmother. But the story had twisted. Now, many whispered that the rich rancher was the greedy one, a manipulator who had contrived the whole thing to steal a child's inheritance. Jake's reputation, once rock solid, was being destroyed. The days leading up to the trial were torturous. Jake barely ate or slept. He was trapped. If he fought to keep the land, he proved Blakemore's accusations true. If he gave it up, he had no legal standing left. The night before they were to leave for Cheyenne, Molly found him alone in the barn, staring blankly at the wall. "Are we going to lose, Papa?" she asked quietly. Jake looked down at her, his face haggard and defeated. "I don't know, Molly," he said honestly. "I don't see a way to win." Molly's chin trembled, but she did not cry. She thought of her real mother's letter. Find a truly good man, a man of honor. She looked at Jake, at the agony in his eyes. He wasn't agonizing over losing the money. He was agonizing over failing her. In that moment, she knew. He was that man. "Yes, you do," she said, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "You know what Mama Rosa said. We have to do what's right, no matter what." Jake stared at his daughter. This tiny girl who had faced down abandonment, starvation, and monsters was now giving him the courage he had lost. A slow, determined light began to dawn in his eyes. "You're right, Molly Rose," he said softly. "You're absolutely right." He knew what he had to do. It was a wild, desperate gamble. It could cost him everything. But it was the only honorable path left. The courtroom in Cheyenne was packed to the rafters. It felt like the entire territory had crammed inside to watch the drama unfold. Cyrus Blakemore sat at one table with his slick lawyer, looking smug and confident. Martha sat beside him, looking both greedy and nervous. At the other table sat Jake, Rosa, and Molly. They looked small and isolated. Blakemore's lawyer, a man named Fitch, was brilliant and ruthless. He painted a masterful, damning picture. He presented Jake as a calculating, predatory land baron who had stumbled upon the secret of the Patterson claim. He detailed how Jake had conveniently adopted the orphaned heir, then entered into a sham marriage, all to cement his control over a silver fortune. He had documents, timelines, and the testimony of the grieving stepmother, Martha, who wept crocodile tears about her stolen child. It was devastating. Jake could feel the mood in the courtroom turning against him. The judge, a stern, impartial man, looked at him with open skepticism. When it was Jake's turn, his own lawyer seemed flustered, unable to counter the narrative Fitch had woven. Finally, the lawyer called Jake to the stand. Jake walked to the witness box, his boots echoing in the silent room. He sat down and faced the judge, ignoring the sea of hostile faces. "Mr. Morrison," his lawyer began weakly, "can you please tell the court why you adopted Molly Patterson?" Jake ignored his lawyer. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and strong, "may I address the court?" The judge, surprised, nodded. "Proceed." "My name is Jake Morrison," he began, "and it's true that I am now the legal owner of the Patterson claim. It is also true that this claim is likely worth a great deal of money, and it is true that I married my wife, Rosa, and adopted my daughter, Molly, after I came into possession of this land." A murmur went through the courtroom. Fitch, the lawyer, grinned. Jake had just admitted to everything. "But Mr. Fitch has the story wrong," Jake continued, his voice rising with power. "He claims I did all this out of greed. He is mistaken." Jake reached into his coat and pulled out 2 documents. "This," he said, holding one up, "is the deed to the Patterson claim, legally registered in my name." He then held up the second document. "And this is a new deed, one I had my lawyer draw up this morning." He looked directly at Molly, his eyes filled with love. "I am hereby signing over the entire Patterson claim and all mineral rights associated with it to a trust to be held for my daughter, Molly Rose Morrison, until she comes of age." He placed the deeds on the witness stand railing. "The land is hers, Your Honor. It was always meant to be hers. I am merely its steward." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel for order. Fitch was on his feet, sputtering, "Your Honor, this is a trick, a grandstanding gesture." "I'm not finished," Jake said, his voice cutting through the noise. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a 3rd piece of paper, the faded, yellowed letter. "This is a letter," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate. "From Molly's mother, Eleanor Patterson. It was her most precious possession, which she guarded her whole life." He looked at the judge. "With the court's permission, I would like to read it." The judge nodded, his expression now one of intense curiosity. Jake read the letter. He read of a mother's love, of a father's discovery. He read of the warning against Martha, and he read the final crucial line: "Trust no one, not until you find a truly good man, a man of honor who will protect you." When he finished, a profound silence held the room. Jake folded the letter carefully. "Your Honor, I am not a perfect man, but I have tried my best to be the man of honor that Eleanor Patterson prayed for. I love this little girl more than any fortune, more than any land, more than life itself. The money means nothing to me. All I want is my daughter." All eyes turned to Martha. Her face was a mask of livid fury. The letter had exposed her. "Lies!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "It's all lies! That money was supposed to be mine! I was married to her father! I deserved it!" In that moment, she confessed everything. Her greed, her motives, her cruelty. Cyrus Blakemore tried to silence her, but it was too late. The entire case, so carefully constructed by Fitch, collapsed into dust. The judge's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. "Case dismissed!" he roared. He fixed Cyrus and Martha with a look of utter contempt. "I am awarding full, permanent, and undisputed custody of the child Molly Rose Morrison to her parents, Jake and Rosa Morrison. Furthermore, I am ordering the territorial marshal to open a criminal investigation into Cyrus Blakemore and Martha Patterson for conspiracy, fraud, and perjury." Justice. It crashed down upon them like a tidal wave. As marshals moved in to take a stunned Cyrus and a hysterical Martha into custody, Jake stepped down from the stand. He walked back to the table and swept Molly up into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Rosa wrapped her arms around them both, and the three of them stood there, an unbreakable island in the swirling chaos of the courtroom. They had won. They hadn't just won a court case. They had won their family. 5 years later, a confident young woman of 14 stood on the high ridge overlooking the Double M ranch, the wind whipping through her long hair. She could ride as well as any cowboy, manage the ranch ledgers better than most businessmen, and she was already helping teach the younger children at the small school her parents had built for the valley. She still wore the gold locket around her neck, a perfect fit now. And deep in a keepsake box in her room, Sarah the rag doll still kept her silent watch. The Double M, and the Patterson claim she now co-managed with her father, had prospered beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The silver had been used not just for them, but to build a real town, with a proper school, a church, and a doctor's office. Her family had grown too. Little Elizabeth, a chatterbox of 3 with Rosa's dark eyes, clung to Molly's side wherever she went. And baby James, just learning to walk, was the spitting image of his father. Sometimes Molly would ride out to this ridge, the very spot where Jake had first seen her. She would look out at the vast, beautiful land and remember the lost, terrified little girl who had stood alone on that dusty trail. She had heard that Cyrus Blakemore died in a prison brawl, and Martha had simply vanished after her release, a ghost swallowed by the territories. Molly rarely thought of them. They were part of a different life, a different girl. Jake rode up beside her, his own horse settling next to hers. He looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, his voice the same gentle rumble she had trusted all those years ago. "I was just thinking," Molly said, a smile playing on her lips. "I was thinking about how different things might have been. If you hadn't been tracking those Mustangs that day. If you hadn't seen me." Jake smiled back, the kind, honest smile that had saved her life. "But I did see you," he said. "And you know what I think?" "What?" "I think it was destiny," he said, his gaze sweeping over the valley, their home, their life. "I think Elizabeth and your mother cooked it up together somewhere up there. They sent us to each other. We were a family, just waiting to be found." Molly leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. "I think you're right, Papa." Together, they turned their horses and rode for home, 2 figures silhouetted against a perfect Wyoming sunset, proof that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried under the ground, but are found in the love and courage of the human heart. If this story of justice, family, and a love that conquers all moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know when the next unforgettable story is waiting to be told.